Star. I'm Sabah Itazaz, and this matters. A young woman was sexually abused by her stepfather when she was 9. When her mother found out, she chose him over her daughter. It reads like an Alice Munro short story, except it's not. This is Andrea Skinner's story. Alice Munro was her mother. Almost a month after the death of Canadian literary giant Alice Munro, a chilling revelation has surfaced. Andrea Skinner, who is Munro's daughter, has revealed in the Toronto Star that her stepfather, Gerald Fremlin, sexually abused her when she was 9 years old. She was only able to tell her mother in a letter when she was in her 20s. Fremlin wrote letters of his own, admitting the abuse in graphic detail and appearing to blame a 9-year-old for the sexual assault. Alice Munro chose to remain with him even after discovering the abuse. For nearly 5 decades, a conspiracy of silence has loomed over the family and within literary and journalistic circles, casting a chill over the legacy of Canada's Nobel laureate, regarded as one of the greatest short story writers of all time, and raising devastating questions about how we view our icons, with uncomfortable truths and complicit silence often lurking just below the shiny surface. More than anything else, this is the story of a survivor and her courage to speak out so others might follow, and a glaring spotlight on a system and society that fails survivors while protecting those that caused the harm. I'll be speaking to the Star's Deborah Dundas, who reported the story. Before we begin, we want to let you know that this episode contains descriptions of child sexual abuse and might be triggering. Please take care while listening. Hi, Deborah. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Sabah.
So we're still reeling and seeing the ripple effects of your reporting and Andrea's story. Let's start with, how did you come to this story?
Well, it's interesting because Andrea has been trying to get the story covered for years. She has reached out to other journalists. She's reached out to other people who were writing about her mother. People knew. And then there was the court case, in 2005 that somehow flew under the radar. So she has sporadically been sending other emails out to journalists, and she sent one out to Heather Malik here at the Star. I would think it was in response to Heather's reaction to her mother's death. And so Heather sent it on to one of our editors, and he asked me if I wanted to do the story. At first I said no, because, it's about sexual abuse. It's taking down an icon. There are so many layers to it. I went, I'm not sure I want to touch this. I was a little bit worried about my own reputation sort of in relationships within the literary community. Then he called me back a little later, and I'd been thinking a lot about it. And I said, no, this story needs to be told, and I'll do it. And I'm glad I did.
Right. And there is so much to unpack in what you just said, especially you talked about how she's been reaching out to journalists. So this is something that's known, and we will talk about it. And then for you to report on this, obviously such an important story. She also told it in her own words, which people can see on the Star site, read both yours and, her personal account. But there's a unique set of ethical dilemmas and challenges that come with reporting something of such a delicate and incredibly painful nature that's left all of us reeling, right?
Absolutely. It's not as if, she came to us, so it's not as if it was going to be an ambush story, right? This isn't something that we initially went digging for, which is a good thing because it meant we could approach it in a way that was respectful. We would be respectful anyway, but there was just an added layer there because of that. We wanted to do a reported piece because she was doing the first person piece, and the reported piece, which, I did absolutely separately, ends up backing up everything. Do you know what I mean? It makes concrete what she's saying. We couldn't have done one without the other. So, that's one thing. The other thing is when talking to people, now all of the siblings, she has 3 siblings, and they were all willing to speak with me, as with the stepmother. but they don't know me. It's very sensitive. Hearts are on the sleeve here. And so what we did was I did pre-interviews with all of them. So, 5 pre-interviews. We spoke for about an hour each time, just telling the story, just getting to know each other a little bit so that there was a connection and so that they could trust me and I could trust them. It's a mutual thing in storytelling.
I wanted to touch on, people know the broad details by now, but the circumstances under which Andrea first revealed her abuse to her mother, Alice Munro, and how everything kind of unraveled from there. Can you talk about that? How did Alice respond to that letter? How would all of this shape the family's dynamics for decades to come?
Well, it was interesting. It first happened when she was 9 years old. Alice and Jim Munro, her first husband, who lived in Victoria, had shared custody. And so Andrea would spend the school year in Victoria with Jim and his wife, Carol, and her stepbrother, Andrew, who was Carol's son. And then she would spend the summers in Clinton, Ontario with Jerry and with Alice. So that just sort of and it can get a little bit complicated. So sort of mapping that out first. So the first summer when she was 9, it occurred, and she went back to Victoria and she told Andrew about it. Andrew told his mother, said, "You have to tell my mother about it. That's just not right." So she told Carol. Carol told Jim, and Jim never spoke to Andrea. So I guess his way was, when she went back next year, the following year, and she wanted to go back. I mean, she loved her mom, right? Kids loved their mom. She wanted to go back. And so they didn't stop her. But what they did is the eldest daughter, Sheila, went back with her. She was about 20 at the time. She went back to sort of run interference, right? Keep her away from Jerry. But Alice was never spoken to about it. This was just their way of trying to keep it under control. And that silence sort of went on for decades. When she was about 19, Andrea, she was having trouble in university and she ended up dropping out. She was having trouble with bulimia. She felt that she could reach out to Alice then, but didn't. Then when she was 25, she thought, no, I'm going to take control of this. She had been having conversations, like in the conversations with Alice. Alice was very concerned about her, wondering why, she was having so much trouble. And she basically told Andrea, you've got so much privilege. What's your problem? Get an IQ test or do something. So it was sort of putting it back on Andrea to take care of it herself. And so she tried that for a few years. And then finally, when she was 25, she thought, no, I'm just going to lay it out there. I'm going to take control of this, but I'm not going to take control of it by denying it. I'm going to take control of it by telling you. So she wrote this letter and she told Alice what happened. Alice was very upset. She left the letter for Jerry to find and then flew to Comox, BC, where she has a condo. They would normally spend the winters there. And Jerry found it, the letter, read it, and it was apparently drama for the next 3 months, sort of from all accounts of the family. A lot of drama. And Jerry, threatened to kill himself, and Alice felt betrayed. And it was a lot of drama, but it was a lot of drama about them. It wasn't about Andrea. And so at the end of the 3 months, Alice went back to him, and then they came back to Ontario.
That's what struck me a lot, where, she talks about this, you talk about this, about how this family was experiencing all of this, and the adults were talking about their feelings and how this was impacting them. And nobody was advocating or talking about what Andrea was going through. And I, want to talk a little bit more about Fremlin's written responses to Andrea's letter, which appeared to be shifting blame essentially onto a 9-year-old.
A 9-year-old. That's the thing. He called her a Lolita. He called himself a Humbert, as if there was something sort of broad and artistic about this or something. But he did that in letters. So to that letter, he responded with letters that he sent to Jim and Carol. And they were his side of the story. They refuted what Andrea had said. To an extent, it was telling his side of the story. So he said, Yes, I climbed into her bed, but he quibbled on the details. Let's put it that way. But he clearly said he abused her. And he said that he thought she was after him sexually. Basically, she had come into the bedroom for sexual misadventure.
He laid the blame on her.
He laid the blame on her. He laid the blame on her. So what she had done is she'd come because Alice had gone away overnight and she wanted to sleep in her mom's bed. She and Jerry shared a bedroom, but they had two beds and Alice's bed was where she wanted to sleep. So Jerry took that to be provocative.
We're talking about a child here, obviously. And as you mentioned, eventually Alice did return to him and then we, shift the dynamics of the family till now. What breaks my heart is that at multiple stages, all of the caregivers in Andrea's life, every adult in her family failed her. And I wondered if you could talk about the family's handling of the abuse and their almost unspoken decision to maintain silence. And it started not just from the letter and then, the consequent reaction. It started all the way back from Jim Munro's silence and Carol's silence when she first told them about the abuse.
That's right. I mean, there was a thing even then, because it was the early 70s, and even then Alice was a big name. She just won the Governor General's Award. Her work was being seen everywhere. So her star was really on the rise. So there is even then a thing about Alice's writing is important. Alice is important. Everything, so the family revolves around her importance and the importance of her writing and the need for her to do her writing. So that fed into everyone thinking, okay, well, we can work this out ourselves. I mean, Andrea told me that, she felt that she was on her own. This is when she knew she was on her own. And it was up to her to figure out how she was going to deal with it.
So Alice Munro's public persona, her literary success even at that time seems to be a contributing factor to the prolonged silence.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sadly, I can very well imagine what it does to a young person to know that there's not a single person who's there to protect you. You're on your own in essentially a situation where you're drowning. How did all of this abuse and the subsequent silence and, the reaction of the family or the lack of reaction of the family affect her mentally and physically and her life overall? You already talked about how she was struggling through her university years.
And that continued, she had tried various ways to heal and she was still hurting. So eventually, when she became pregnant with twins, she told Alice that she couldn't have her kids around Jerry. Alice said, well, that's a big inconvenience for me because Jerry does the driving. As I was saying earlier, Alice wasn't very good with, the everyday life. And, he took care of the car, the bills, the everything. So, and she didn't drive. So, she relied on him for all of that. So it drove a rift into the family. I mean, she stopped talking to some of her siblings. She figured that they were happy enough to have her sort of move away from the family or back away because it would make it easier for them, right? She just backed away. Now, in 2005, she took control even further. What she did was she took the letters because she needed and wanted something on the record that said, this guy did this to me. And so she phoned the OPP. She was living in Ontario at the time. She phoned the OPP and she handed the letters, those incriminating letters, to the OPP. So they charged Jerry. He ended up pleading guilty to one charge of indecent assault and received a sentence of 2 years probation. And he had to seek counseling and, sort of various other things. So that was there, that was on the record, that was done. And that gave her some relief because here it was, that was there now. He was a criminal, right?
And she took action, she did something.
And she took action. She did that for herself. So even then it went in and then it just went back to normal. As one of the sisters, Jenny, said to me, the family kept socializing with the pedophile and that was it. Everything carried on. So that went on for a long time. And, Jerry passed in 2013. Jim passed in 2016, I think it was. Alice passed just recently. But around 2016, Jenny and the rest of the family, Jenny took the lead on this though, wanted to do something because they were hurting as well. They wanted her back in their lives. They missed her. And you have to realize, I think, and they realized at that point that they were all victims of this, right? They didn't feel like victims before, but they were all victims of this because they all lost something. And so Jenny looked up and found a place in Toronto called the Gatehouse. And the three of them, the three siblings, so Jenny and Sheila and Andrew, went and spoke to them, started their own healing process really, and realized, what was happening. And, they wrote letters to Andrea saying they were sorry for what had happened and sort of opening up communications. It took a little while for Andrea to sort of respond. She had been sort of in touch with some of them, here and there, but not Sheila and not Alice. And then they managed to, she went and met at the Gatehouse too with them, and they've been working through it ever since. Again, I think she had wanted it to go public for a long time. Nobody had picked up on it. So her family was quite behind her on this. As I said, I spoke to all of them, and I'll tell you, it was painful. It was painful for them because they're hurting. There were tears in every single conversation I had with Andrea and with all the siblings and with her stepmother, Carol. It's a hard thing to do. That's why I wanted to do the pre-interview, sort of going, back to the first, because then when we did the recorded interviews, they knew what was coming, and so did I, and we felt comfortable. So they were very, very open as a result. I think that was a very important thing to do, was take everyone through the process of this storytelling. And that's what the Gatehouse did as well. So they've managed to reconcile. They said they didn't know. So, and this is just mind-boggling. They didn't know the details. Andrew says the story was still in my 11-year-old mind, as if, this has been taken care of, because Andrea seemed on many levels so well-adjusted, happy, but she was hiding it all inside, right?
Yeah, that's how trauma plays.
Precisely. So, it's not obvious from the outside. So he was seeing her like that. And then Sheila and Jenny had their perspectives, but they hadn't compared notes. So this was the first time they went, oh my gosh, this is what happened. And so they were able to reach out to Andrea then, and they all said, they felt complicit. But, that's the dynamics, and that's the adults in the family, sort of encouraging that, right?
Right. I mean, when you're children, even if you're older siblings, or you are expecting the grown-ups to have handled the situation. So that's the automatic default position, right?
That's right. And they thought it had been handled.
So it seems that this was a step in healing in terms of going to a Gatehouse and sharing this story. Coming back to the conviction of Jerry that you talked about, what has shocked so many is that Andrea did come forward. She did take action. She talked to the police in 2004, and he was actually convicted for this. He pled guilty.
Yeah.
And it just boggles the mind. How would something like this remain hidden or shrouded in silence by literary and publishing circles? What about the media? Why wasn't it covered? And we're talking about arguably the most well-known writer of Canada. So how did this happen? Or is it because it happened because it's the most well-known writer in Canada?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? How did people cover it up? I know Sheila worked with Alice's editor at McClelland and Stewart, Doug Gibson, to write a memoir of life growing up with Alice Munro, called Lives of Mothers and Daughters. And she only wanted to go up to when she was age 20, 21, because she could speak freely about that. She didn't want to go any further. But because it was about sort of the Munro family, or Alice's, the Laidlaw family, which was Alice's maiden name, the editor said, well, people are going to want to know what happened to the aunts, the uncles, and so on. So you need to go further and complete the story. And she felt uncomfortable doing that, but she did it, because that was for the greater good. I don't know what he knew or didn't know. I've reached out to him. We'll see what happens. I've reached out to a number of other people. I've reached out to Margaret Atwood, who's a close friend of hers. And Margaret and I have been emailing back and forth. And she said that she didn't know about that until after Jerry died. She said once Jerry died in 2013, and once Alice's mental capabilities declined, because she suffered very, very bad dementia in her final years, her final 12 years or so. So Margaret says she didn't know anything about it until after that, and she found out from a couple of other people. And she said, and she was shocked because it wasn't the Alice she knew. That's what she said. It wasn't the Alice she knew. She knew a different Alice. But that's what the daughter said too, right? They had a different perspective of Alice. So people can be different people to themselves and to others. And that's part of it. Others in the publishing industry, other friends, I don't know. I've reached out to some people. I think people are processing this, and people who might have been aware of it are coming to terms with this. Maybe we'll hear more in the coming days.
Like you mentioned, Margaret Atwood, who is a colleague and close friend of Alice, did know about this since 2013. And there might be others, like we know now that her biographer, Robert Thacker, had an idea because Andrea wrote to him just before the biography was published. And it seems that there is a hesitation to disturb the status quo, or, maybe they were waiting for, Andrea to tell her story herself. But how do we reconcile with all of this? Because it has shaken the way I, for example, perceive the literary world and the narratives that we tend to celebrate and the people that we tend to celebrate. How do we reconcile? Have you thought about that?
Oh, sure. I mean, not to bring myself into this, but when I wrote my book on class, I was talking all about the narratives that are in the literary world right now, and they're of a certain class. I mean, there are certain things that get told and certain stories that get told and that don't get told. I think what this is going to do within the literary world in terms of Alice Munro is we're going to read her differently. I don't necessarily think it's going to be that we're going to read her negatively. I think it's going to give us a more robust understanding of her writing because it's all there, right? It's all there. In terms of Robert Thacker, I can't speak for him. Margaret Atwood said that she didn't want to approach them because, them being the family or Andrea, because she found out after, and she didn't want, she thought it would be sensitive. She didn't want to bring up a sore topic with them. It was a personal thing as far as anybody knows, so that's sort of part of it. I think more broadly, there's a reckoning in terms of the literary community because journalists were approached over the years and things were kept hidden, even publicly. It's the open secrets, right? And that was, in fact, in 1994 when Andrea told Alice, wrote the letter. The next book that Alice came out with was Open Secrets.
Right. And we are talking about a reckoning, but other than the fame and privilege aspect of this and what is happening within the literary world, what struck me is also how this has resonated with everyone. So it's not just the literary world. It's so many survivors I saw on social media opening up about their experiences. It's kind of led to a chain reaction. And I wonder what that says to you about how common this also is, about how the system and our society is failing survivors of abuse, particularly within these family structures. Have people reached out to you as well?
I've had so many people reach out to me and say, thank you for this story. Andrea is so brave. Finally, I feel like I'm not alone. I'm also estranged from my family. I mean, it's been email after email after email, and it is pretty amazing. The thing is, that's what Andrea wanted to come out of this. She wanted to help other people. She wanted people to know that they can speak up, that it's never too late, that even the children of famous people have a right to have their story told. And this is how it can be handled. Good for her. This is her story. I mean, in a way, this isn't Alice Munro's story. This is Andrea Skinner's story. And if we all keep that in mind, I think that's what she wants. And that's what she did this for.
And it's giving a message to survivors of abuse and,
Absolutely.
how this is, like we talked about, not an uncommon situation.
It's not an
families
uncommon.
and societies and the system. We talked about the writing. So many have found it almost macabre in retrospect, or uncanny that Alice Munro's stories often chronicle the lives and turmoils and complexities of women and girls, often writing about similar situations that Andrea seems to have experienced. And as we confront these new unsettling revelations, how does this darkness, this chapter, alter the lens through which we view her work and her legacy?
I think it makes it sharper, to be honest with you. She, since the beginning, since before this happened, since, even Lives of Girls and Women, there was that happening. So I think there's a broader story to be told. And she was telling it about this happening in small towns, about this being covered up. All of her work was about domesticity and the way there are terrible things lurking under the surface. There's a cynicism. There's these horrible things that happen and they're hidden. I mean, that's throughout her work, straight from day one, right through to the end. There are ones that we're going to read and say, this seems, pulled from real life. It's funny because, Lives of Girls and Women, she said, this story is true in form, not in fact. So she's talking about what's going on, but not about the specific details. A lot of people in Wingham, Ontario, where she grew up, didn't like her writing because she wrote about them, in a way. She wasn't naming people. She was just taking details of life as she observed it in the world around her in small town Ontario and the lives of women and girls especially. And she wrote about it. It was, to quote another one of her books, it was material, or her stories, it was material. It's all material for the stories.
Well, that's something a lot of people will be thinking about as they're reading the work. Thank you so much, Deborah, for your time and for your incredibly important reporting. I would urge everybody to go on star.com and read your investigative report, as well as Andrea's story in her own words, which is so, so important. I really, really appreciate you talking to me about this.
Thanks so much. Thanks for such sensitive questions.
Here's Alice Munro in 1990, reading aloud from her short story collection, Friend of My Youth.
My mother surprising me and doing it almost indifferently. Her mask, her fate, and most of her affliction taken away. How relieved I was and happy. But now I recall that I was disconcerted as well. I would have to say that I felt slightly cheated. Yes. Offended, tricked, cheated by this welcome turnaround, this reprieve. My mother, moving rather carelessly out of her old prison, showing options and powers I never dreamed she had, changes more than herself. She changes the bitter lump of love I have carried all this time into a phantom, something useless and uncalled for, like a phantom pregnancy.